Welcome back to AI Paper Podcasts. Today, we're going to be looking at this paper, Demystifying Long Chain of Thought Reasoning in LLMs.
Yeah, by Edward Yeo and his team.
Yeah.
It's a really cool paper. I think, one of the things that's been most exciting in the field recently has been the sort of, emergence of reasoning in LLMs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's
Yeah.
one of the things that makes everyone kind of go, whoa, what just happened?
Yeah.
These LLMs are showing their work step by step.
Right. And there's this sense that, if they can do all these things, maybe general intelligence really is just around the corner or something.
Right. Or, at least we're on the right track to something very, very interesting.
Yeah. And so this paper really tackles one of the big questions, which is, how do we get these very long chains of thought reliably and efficiently?
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that was so fascinating with, even just models like GPT-4, is that it seemed like a lot of the reasoning was emerging just by scaling up the inference time, giving the model more time to think. And that was kind of a surprise to a lot of people, like, oh, we can get all this reasoning just by, changing the inference time.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that these researchers uncovered when they're looking at, how do we actually train models to be able to do this?
Yeah, so they have a couple of really interesting findings. One of them is that supervised fine-tuning works surprisingly well for this.
No.
It's not as bad as you might think, at least when you're using the right data.
So like just giving the model a ton of examples actually gets it.
Yeah, surprisingly far.
Pretty far.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, it gives you a really nice baseline to then improve upon with reinforcement learning.
So are they saying we don't need reinforcement learning?
No, not quite. Reinforcement learning is still quite important.
Okay.
But it can be a little bit unstable.
In what way?
Well, one thing they observe is that sometimes the chain of thought length can fluctuate wildly during RL training.
I can see that happening. Yeah.
Yeah, like it might suddenly start generating these ridiculously long chains of thought that are longer than the context window, and that actually hurts performance.
Yeah. It's like it gets too excited about thinking and forgets to actually do the task.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to spend all my time thinking and not actually solve the problem.
Answer the question.
Yeah. So to fix that, they introduce a new reward function that they call a cosine length scaling reward.
Okay, interesting.
And this essentially allows them to control the chain of thought length.
So it's like a dial that controls how much the AI...
Yeah, exactly, like a volume knob for their thinking.
Okay.
And so what it does is that it encourages longer chains of thought when the model is struggling.
Okay.
But it rewards shorter, more efficient solutions when it's doing well.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And you can tune the parameters of this reward function to get different length scaling behaviors, which is quite neat.
I'm sure the AI's found ways to game this system, though.
Oh, of course they did.
Yeah.
So they observed that even with this smart reward system, the models can sometimes try to cheat by padding their chain of thought with just repetitive nonsense.
Just to maximize the reward.
Yeah, just to maximize the reward.
Yeah.
So to prevent that, they introduce a repetition penalty.
Okay.
Which essentially penalizes the model for repeating the same tokens.
So that makes it think in a more genuine way.
Encourages it to think in a more genuine way.
Okay.
And then they also look at optimal discount factors for the RL algorithm. And this is a bit technical, but basically it affects how much the model focuses on short-term versus long-term rewards.
Okay.
And they find that different reward types actually work best with different discount factors.
For example?
Yeah. So, for example, the repetition penalty works best with a low discount factor because it needs to give a very strong signal to stop that behavior immediately.
Like a slap on the wrist.
Yeah. Whereas the reward for actually selecting the correct answer needs a higher discount factor because it needs to allow the model to be rewarded for finding the right answer, even if it takes a few more steps to get there.
Okay, so those were all about getting the model to reason effectively. What about, the data itself that the model's learning from? We know that data is key for complex reasoning tasks.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. The data is super important.
Right.
And so they tackled this challenge of, getting enough high quality data with verifiable answers for RL training.
Yeah, which is always a challenge.
Which is always a challenge.
Yeah.
And one of the things they explore is using what they call silver supervised data.
Okay.
And so this is essentially, web extracted data that is not perfectly clean.
Yeah, like a budget data option.
Yeah. But they find that it can actually be quite effective, especially when you combine it with, some existing high-quality data.
So like you get the best of both worlds, you get that sort of precise curated data, and then you get all the richness and diversity of the real-world data.
And one of the data sets they look at is this WebInstruct data set,
Okay.
which is this massive data set that's scraped from the web
Oh, wow.
of instruction following examples.
Yeah.
And they have to do some work to, handle the noise and the inconsistencies in the data.
So how do they do that?
Yeah. So they explore a couple of different verification approaches. One is they use a rule-based verifier, which essentially checks the model's answers against a set of predefined rules.
Okay, so it's like an automated fact checker.
Yeah, exactly. And they find that this approach works pretty well, especially when they filter the data set to only include examples that have short form answers. But of course, not all answers are short form, right?
Right.
So for the more complex answers, they experiment with a model-based verifier, which uses another LLM to evaluate the model's responses.
Oh, wow. So like a senior LLM
Yeah.
checking the work of
Checking the work of a junior LLM.
the junior LLM.
But they find that actually the rule-based verifier combined with filtering for short form answer prompts actually consistently gives them better performance.
Okay. So they're basically saying if you want to scale up this training, you got to be really smart about how you curate that data.
You got to be smart about how you curate the data, how you filter it, and how you verify it.
Okay.
Now, one really interesting question that they explore is, whether some of these reasoning abilities might already exist in these base models.
Right. Like maybe it's already there. We're just coaxing it out.
Yeah.
Training.
Yeah, like can we get complex reasoning to emerge just from reinforcement learning without any initial fine-tuning on long chain of thought examples?
Right.
And so they try to replicate some of the results from a model called DeepSeek R1, which showed these really impressive emergent reasoning abilities.
Yeah.
And they do this using a smaller model called Quinn 2.5 Math 7B.
Okay.
And they find some really interesting things.
Like what?
So, for example, one behavior they look at is self-validation. So this is essentially the model double-checking its work.
Okay.
And initially, this was thought to be an emergent property.
So like something totally new that the model had learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they find some evidence that it might actually be present to some extent in the base model already.
Oh, wow.
Which is really interesting. It raises questions about, what exactly do we mean by emergent? How do we define that?
Yeah.
And another thing they find is that the length scaling behavior, so the increasing chain of thought length during training, might actually be influenced by the KL divergence penalty in the RL algorithm.
Oh, so like a technical detail that's sort of pushing it in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not clear whether this is really genuine learning or whether it's just, being pushed towards the pre-training distribution.
Right.
And in the end, they're not able to fully replicate the DeepSeek R1 behavior with this smaller model.
Oh, interesting.
Which suggests that there might be some limitations either in terms of model size or maybe something about the pre-training data.
Okay. So it seems like there's maybe a certain threshold that needs to be crossed before you can get those really sophisticated
Yeah, maybe there's a certain threshold of complexity that needs to be
reasoning abilities.
Yeah,
No?
and they find that overall RL from long coat SFT generally gives better performance than RL from the base model.
Okay. So starting with those good examples is really key.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating to think about how those abilities are emerging and where they're coming from.
Yeah, it's like we're watching
It's like we're
a
watching
new form of intelligence.
Yeah, new kind of intelligence being born.
Yeah.
And we're not even really sure how it's happening.
Right. We're not really sure how it's happening.
Yeah.
But it's definitely exciting.
Yeah. Okay, let's dig into some of the specifics here. Starting with that supervised fine-tuning.
Okay.
You mentioned that they were looking at, long-versi-short chain of thought data for the fine-tuning.
Yeah.
What do they find there?
Yeah, so they find that SFT using long chain of thought examples continues to improve accuracy even with massive amounts of data, whereas SFT using short chain of thought examples kind of hits a ceiling much earlier.
So it's like the difference between giving a student just the bullet points versus giving them the full explanation with all the details.
Exactly. You need those detailed explanations if you
yeah.
want them to really understand the concepts.
And what about the impact on reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so they find that initializing RL training with long coat SFT leads to much larger gains than using short coat SFT.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The better the foundation, the better the ultimate outcome.
Now, you might be wondering, how do we actually create these long coat examples in the first place?
Yeah, like where do you get those long explanations from?
Right. So they explore two main methods. One is to construct coat Ts by chaining together smaller reasoning steps that are generated by a short coat T model.
Okay, so like building up a big explanation for the
Yes.
smaller ones.
Yeah. And the other method is to distill long Hoth examples directly from a more powerful LLM that already exhibits those emergent reasoning patterns.
Okay, so it's like learning from a master.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they find that using these distilled emergent long Kati patterns actually leads to significantly better performance,
Oh, how?
especially when combined with RL.
So it really matters how you teach them how to reason.
It really matters how you teach them how to reason.
Okay, so that's all about the fine-tuning. What about the reward design?
Yeah, so they find that RL can lead to some unpredictable behavior in terms of chain of thought length.
Yeah, we talked about that a bit.
Right.
How sometimes it gets carried away.
Yeah, it gets carried away.
Yeah.
And to address this, they introduce this cosine length scaling reward.
Right, that volume knob for the AI's thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which encourages longer chains of thought when the model is struggling, but rewards shorter, more efficient solutions when it's doing well.
Okay. And they also found ways to prevent the AI from cheating.
Yeah, they found that the AI can try to cheat by padding its chain of thought with meaningless repetition,
Right.
just to maximize the length-based reward.
So you get those points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to prevent that, they introduce a repetition penalty, which penalizes the model for repeating the same tokens.
Okay. And they also look at those discount factors for the RL algorithm.
Right. And they find that different reward types actually work best with different discount factors.
Yeah, you mentioned that like that repetition penalty works best with a low discount factor because it needs to provide a strong immediate signal
Exactly.
to discourage that behavior.
It's like, you got to punish them right away.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas the reward for correctness needs a higher discount factor
Yeah.
because it needs to allow the model to be rewarded for finding the right answer, even if it takes a few more steps.
So it's about balancing that short-term thinking
Yeah.
with that long-term payoff.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all really interesting stuff. But we are talking about AI models here, and they can be pretty clever. Did they find any evidence of the AI trying to game the system?
Oh, they definitely did. They observed that the AI would sometimes try to pad its chain of thought with meaningless repetition just to rack up those length-based rewards without actually demonstrating any real improvement in its reasoning.
Yeah, classic AI.
Yeah, classic AI.
So how did they address that?
So they introduced a repetition penalty to the reward function, which penalizes the model for repeating the same words or phrases.
So basically saying no points for being a broken record.
Exactly.
You got to be original here.
Gotta be original.
Yeah.
Think for yourself.
Okay, so that makes sense. Now, the paper also delves into this concept of optimal discount factors. Can you explain what those are and why they matter in this context?
Yeah, so in reinforcement learning, a discount factor basically determines how much weight the model gives to future rewards versus immediate rewards.
Okay.
So a high discount factor means the model is more patient, willing to invest effort now for a bigger payoff later.
So it's like setting the AI's level of impulsivity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And they find that different reward types work best with different discount factors.
For example.
Yeah, so for example, that repetition penalty we talked about works best with a low discount factor because it needs to provide a strong immediate signal to discourage those repetitive behaviors.
Got it. Like instant feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas the discount factor for the correctness reward needs to be higher, allowing the model to be adequately rewarded for ultimately selecting the correct answer, even if it took a few more steps to get there.
Okay, so it's about encouraging that strategic thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really fascinating how these little tweaks to the reward function can shape the model's, kind of personality in a way.
Yeah, it really highlights how important it is to understand the underlying mechanisms of reinforcement learning.
Yeah.
And how we can tune those mechanisms to guide the model's learning.
It's like we're not just throwing data at these models, we're carefully designing the learning experience to cultivate those reasoning skills. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about fine-tuning reward design. But what about the data itself? We know that getting enough high-quality data with verifiable answers is a major challenge in this field.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
Especially for these complex reasoning tasks.
Yeah, and so in this paper, they actually explore using what they call silver supervised data to scale up the training process.
Okay, so that's that sort of budget data we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. It's web extracted data that's not perfectly clean.
Right.
But they find that it can actually be quite effective, especially when you combine it with those smaller, high-quality data sets.
So it's like getting the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
You get the precision and the structure of those curated data sets,
Right.
but then you also get the richness and the diversity of that real-world data.
Yeah, and one of the data sets they look at is this WebInstruct data set,
Okay.
which is this massive collection of instruction-following examples that's scraped from the web.
Oh, wow.
And they have to do some work to handle the noise and inconsistencies in the data.
Yeah. So how do they do that?
Yeah, so they explore a couple of different verification approaches.
Okay.
One is to use a rule-based verifier, which essentially checks the model's answers against a set of predefined rules.
Okay, so it's like an automated fact checker.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And they find that this approach works pretty well, especially when they filter the data set to only include examples that have short-form answers.
Yeah.
But of course, not all answers are short-form.
Right.
So for the more complex answers, they experiment with a model-based verifier, which uses another more powerful LLM to evaluate the model's responses.
Oh, wow. So it's like bringing in a senior expert to
Yeah.
review the work of a junior.
Exactly. Exactly. But they find that the rule-based verifier combined with filtering for short-form answer prompts consistently yields better performance.
Okay, so it's a matter of finding the right tool for the job.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the importance of being thoughtful about how we curate and filter and verify the data that we use to train these models.
It's not just about throwing more data at the problem.
Right.
It's about being strategic and using the right techniques.
Exactly.
Okay, this has been a fantastic overview of the paper. So far, we've talked about fine-tuning reward design and data verification. But one question that keeps coming up is where these reasoning abilities actually come from.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question.
Are they truly emergent, or are they somehow already present in these base models?
Yeah, and that's something that the researchers actually explore in this paper.
Okay, so let's dive into that.
Let's dive into that. Yeah, so they designed an experiment to see if they could replicate the emergent reasoning abilities that were seen in a model called DeepSeek R1.
Okay.
And they tried to do this using a smaller model called Quen 2.5 Math 7B.
Okay, so like a mini experiment within the bigger experiment.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And they wanted to see if they could get these abilities to emerge just from reinforcement learning without any initial fine-tuning on long chain of thought examples.
So like, could they recreate those aha moments that we see in human learning? Where, someone suddenly figures out how to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the results were really interesting. One of the things they looked at was this behavior called self-validation.
Okay, so like the model double-checking its own work.
Exactly.
Okay.
And initially, this was thought to be an emergent property.
Right, like something totally new that had emerged through training.
But they found some evidence that it might actually be present to some extent in the base model already.
Oh, wow.
Which is really fascinating. It raises questions about, what does it actually mean for something to be emergent?
Right, like how do we define emergence?
Yeah, how do we define emergence?
If it's already there in some form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing they found was that the length, the scaling behavior, so the way that the chain of thought length increases during training might actually be influenced by this KL divergence penalty in the RL algorithm.
Okay, so it's like a technical detail that's kind of pushing it in a certain direction.
Yeah, it's a technical detail that's kind of pushing it back towards its pre-training distribution.
Right, so it's not clear if it's truly learning or if it's just being nudged back to what it already knew.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in the end, they weren't able to fully replicate the DeepSeek R1 behavior with this smaller model.
Oh, interesting.
Which suggests that there might be some limitations, either in terms of model size or maybe something about the pre-training data.
Right. So it seems like there's maybe a certain threshold that you need to cross.
Yeah, maybe there's a certain threshold of complexity
Before you can get those really impressive reasoning abilities.
Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like they're finding that reinforcement learning from that long chain of thought, supervised fine-tuning, generally leads to better performance than just doing reinforcement learning from the base model.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so starting with those good examples is
Yeah, you really need that strong foundation.
really key. It's just really fascinating to think about all these different aspects of how these reasoning abilities are emerging.
Yeah, and where they're coming from.
And where they're coming from.
Yeah.
It's like we're watching this new kind of intelligence
It's like we're watching a new kind of intelligence.
being born.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't even really know how it's happening.
And we don't really know how it's happening.
It's really exciting.
Yeah, it's super exciting.
Okay, so we've talked about, the supervised fine-tuning the reward design.
Okay.
Now let's talk about the data itself. We know that getting enough high-quality data with verifiable answers is a huge challenge
Yeah, it's a massive challenge.
in this field,
Yeah.
especially for those complex reasoning tasks.
Especially for complex reasoning.
Yeah. So how did they address this?
So they actually explore using what they call silver supervised data to try to scale up the training process.
Okay, so that's that kind of budget data that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. It's web extracted data that's not perfectly clean. But they find that it can actually be surprisingly effective, especially when you combine it with, smaller, high quality data sets.
So it's like getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you get
Yeah.
that precise curated data,
Yeah.
but you also get the richness and the diversity of that real world data.
Yeah. And they were looking at the WebInstruct data set, right?
Yeah, one of the data sets they looked at is the WebInstruct data set, which is this massive data set of instruction following examples that they scrape from the web.
Okay, so they're going out there and getting all this real world data.
Yeah, they're going out there and getting all this real world data.
Okay, but how do they deal with the fact that it's noisy and inconsistent?
Yeah, so they explore a couple of different verification approaches.
Okay.
One of them is to use a rule-based verifier, which basically checks the model's answers against a set of predefined rules.
Okay, so it's like an automated fact checker.
Yeah, exactly, like an automated fact checker.
Yeah.
And they find that this approach works pretty well, especially when they filter the data set to only include examples that have short-form answers.
Okay.
But of course, not all answers are short form.
Right.
So for the more complex answers, they experiment with a model-based verifier, which uses another more powerful LLM to evaluate the model's responses.
Okay, so they're bringing in like a senior LLM
Yeah.
to double check the work of the junior LLMs.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they find that the rule-based verifier, combined with filtering for those short-form answer prompts, actually consistently yields better performance.
Okay, so there's a certain sweet spot there
Yeah.
in terms of matching the verification technique to
To the type of data.
the type of data.
Yeah.
Okay. And this really highlights, I think, how scaling up the training of these reasoning models is not just about throwing more data at them.
Right.
It's about being really thoughtful about
It's about being really thoughtful about how you curate that data, how you filter it,
how you curate that
that
data.
you verify it.
Yeah, you verify it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so this leads us to another interesting question that the paper explores, which is whether those patterns of reasoning that we're trying to cultivate in these models actually exist in human communication.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question.
Like, are we essentially teaching them to think like us by observing how we think?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so they specifically looked at online discussion forums where people are, collaboratively tackling complex problems,
Okay.
brainstorming different approaches, backtracking, correcting each other's errors, and essentially engaging in these long chains of collaborative reasoning.
So they're looking at how humans naturally reason together in those online communities.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they found some evidence that these patterns do exist,
Really?
which suggests that the long chain of thought patterns that we're seeing in these models might not be entirely artificial.
Oh, wow.
They might actually be a reflection of the way that humans naturally reason and solve problems together.
That's amazing. It's like they're learning from the digital fingerprints of
Yes.
human thought.
It's like they're learning from the echoes of our thinking that are embedded in these online discussions.
That's really cool. Okay, so it seems like this paper is not just about the technical aspects of training these reasoning models.
Yeah.
It's also about understanding the social and cultural context
Yeah.
in which they're learning and evolving.
Exactly.
And the paper wraps up by outlining some really exciting directions for future research.
Yeah, they really emphasize that this is just the beginning.
Okay, so what are some of those next steps that they propose?
Yeah, so one of the key areas that they highlight is scaling up model size.
So bigger models, bigger brains.
Exactly. They believe that as we build larger and more complex models, we're likely to unlock even more sophisticated reasoning capabilities.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but it's not just about brute force computation. They also acknowledge that the infrastructure for training these massive models, especially with reinforcement learning, is still quite limited.
Right. We've talked about those challenges with hardware and efficiency.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act between pushing those computational limits and developing more efficient training techniques.
Exactly.
And they also highlight the need for more sophisticated and scalable methods for verifying the model's responses.
Yeah, especially as models become more complex
Right.
and the responses become harder to evaluate.
Yeah, and they suggest exploring those self-supervised approaches.
Yeah, where the model might learn to kind of assess its own reasoning without relying on those external rule-based systems or those larger, more computationally expensive LLMs.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
It's like we're talking about AI systems that can think for themselves and then critique their own thinking.
Exactly. And it really speaks to this question of, what other hidden capabilities might be lurking within these base models.
Right. Like what other surprises are waiting to be unlocked?
Yeah, if they're already learning to reason from human dialogue, what else are they picking up from that vast sea of data they're trained on?
Yeah. What other skills and talents might emerge?
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be working in AI.
Yeah. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Absolutely. This paper is a must-read for anyone who's interested in the future of AI.
All right. Well, that wraps up another episode of AI Paper Podcasts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of long chain of thought reasoning in LLMs.
It's a field that's evolving rapidly, and we're only just beginning to understand its potential.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of AI responsibly.
And always remember, the future of AI is a future we create together.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about how these models are learning from those echoes of human thought.
It really makes you question, what is intelligence and what
Yeah.
is learning?
Where does it come from?
Where does it come from?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, we were talking about how those researchers actually looked at whether those behaviors that they were incentivizing during reinforcement learning
Right.
were actually present in human dialogue.
Yeah, so one of the things they looked at was this idea of self-validation.
So the model, revisiting its solution and potentially correcting its own errors.
Okay.
And guess what? They found evidence of this in online forums where people are, collaboratively working on these complex problems.
Really?
Yeah, they're bouncing ideas off each other, they're identifying mistakes, they're essentially doing this long chain of thought reasoning together.
So it's like the models are learning these strategies, not just from the instructions, but from watching how humans do it
Exactly.
in the real world.
They're watching us.
Yeah.
And they're learning from us.
It's really cool. I mean, it really highlights how important it is to think about not just the technical aspects of training these models,
Right.
but also the social and cultural
And the
context
context in which they're learning.
in which they're learning.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the paper wraps up by outlining some really exciting directions for future research.
Yeah, and they emphasize that this is really just the beginning.
So what are some of the things they propose?
Well, one of the key things they highlight is this idea of scaling up model size.
Okay, so bigger models,
Bigger model.
bigger brains.
Yeah, they believe that as we build larger and more complex models, we'll unlock even more sophisticated reasoning capabilities.
That makes sense. I mean, it seems intuitive that more
Yeah.
compute power would lead to more intelligence.
Yeah, but it's not just about brute force computation.
Right.
They also acknowledge that, the infrastructure for training these massive models, especially with reinforcement learning, is still quite limited.
Right. We've talked about that.
There are challenges with hardware utilization and efficiency.
So it's a balancing act between pushing those limits and finding more efficient ways to train.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they also highlight the need for better ways to verify the model's responses.
Right, because as the models get more complex, those responses get harder to evaluate.
Exactly.
So what do they suggest?
Well, they suggest exploring some of these self-supervised approaches,
Okay.
where the model could learn to assess its own reasoning
Right.
without relying on those external rule-based systems or those larger, more powerful but computationally expensive LLMs.
It's almost like giving the AI metacognition,
Yeah.
like the ability to think about its own thinking.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating idea.
Wow. It really is incredible to think about where this field is headed.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be working in AI.
Okay, well, that wraps up another episode of AI Paper Podcasts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into long chain of thought reasoning in LLMs.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been great having you.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of AI responsibly.
And always remember, the future of AI is a future that we create together.